7 o'clock Central. So whichever time zone you're in at that point, 7 o'clock Central. So welcome everybody. My name is Pastor Shannon First, and I am a pastor out in Seattle, Washington. I also work with a group called Living Well, and that is actually how I met Pastor Andrea. Within that group. And Living Well really focuses on providing holistic health for ministry leaders, especially within the context of the struggles that ministry leaders have. So as I will say, I'm a Wisconsin girl at heart. I grew up in Racine, Wisconsin, so between Milwaukee and Chicago. And so I grew up in the Milwaukee Synod, and then I was a youth director in Waunakee, the only Waunakee in the world, just outside of Madison, before I went to seminary. Following seminary, I was in Council Bluffs, Iowa for 6 years, and then I've been here in Seattle for almost 5. Health and wellness is a big passion of mine, and working with ministry leaders within the context of health and wellness is a huge passion. So as we go through today, I am going to ask that you mute yourselves just so that we don't hear the background noise. But please feel free to unmute. There will be options and opportunities to chat. And also please utilize the chat box. Andrea will be moderating the chat box for us. With that, there's going to be a lot of information in a very short amount of time. When we get to the end, I will have a slide that has all my contact information. So if you're interested in learning more or wanting to have further conversation, there's a good way to get a hold of me. The other piece that I just wanted to mention about this is, as I talk about this, I know that there's a big mix of both clergy and lay leaders and paid staff and unpaid staff and volunteers. And so I'm using the phrase as ministry leaders. And so know that this is not just about ordained clergy, but about all ministry leaders and the health and wellness that really impacts our ministries and the congregations. So let's begin. Holistic health for holistic living. Sorry, one more. I did just want to also mention that while I am a pastor, I also have my Precision Nutrition Level 2 certification, which highly focuses on coaching and coaching within health and wellness, and also the International Coaching Federation certification. So one thing I would like you to do as we start is just take a moment. You can jot this down if you'd like. And I want you to think about, how would you define deep health? How would you define deep health? And if you want to jot it down on a Post-it note or a scratch piece of paper, we'll come back to this at the end. Or on your phone, you're welcome to do that. So how do you define deep health? And hang on to that. Well, one of the ways, there can be many definitions, but one definition that I look at with deep health is how everything is interconnected. Our thoughts, our feelings, our environment all affect the integrated work of our brain and our hormones, our men and women, our immune systems, along with the rest of our body. Basically, it's when all dimensions of health are in sync and we're able to create resiliency within that. So what are some of the areas or the dimensions of health? You know, when we talk about deep health or when we talk about health and wellness, immediately we go to, oh, eat well and exercise. That's true, but it's actually only one portion and one small portion. The other really interesting thing about nutrition and movement or exercise is the way that we engage with our nutrition is actually very, very similar to the way that we engage with other pieces of our lives. So when we can identify some of the stressors or some of our responses around food, it actually can teach us a lot about our stressors and responses in many other areas within our work or our leadership or our family or our relationships. It's really actually quite fascinating. So what are some of the dimensions of deep health? One of them is relational, where we feel connected, where we have authentic relationships and where we feel supported and like you belong. Think about Maslow's hierarchy of need. One of the bases is belonging. So a dimension of deep health is feeling like you belong, feeling like you're part of a group, feeling like you have friends or a family or a support group. Another is spiritual and feeling spiritually whole, maybe feeling a sense of meaning or purpose in life. Or maybe it's about understanding your beliefs and your values and your ethics. Everybody is going to identify all of these dimensions slightly differently, but with a pretty general overarching understanding. Another dimension is financial. Are we taking steps to live within our financial means? Are we living and planning for a financial health, both now and into the future? Of course, there's the physical health that I think a lot of people can identify with. Are we feeling vibrant? Are we feeling energized? Are we thriving? Are we performing and functioning well? Can we make it through a day and end not feeling like we've been run over by a Mack truck? Can we move and feel more energized after that? Can we work towards caring for our muscles and not feeling as tight or as stiff? Because a lot of what we do at younger ages really affects the movement and the ability that we have for mobility when we're in our later years. Another area of deep health is emotional and mental. Are we able to experience a full range of emotions? Do we feel safe in expressing those emotions well? Again, whether that's in a friendship, a family, a partner, with your leadership, with your church, with your friends. And part of that emotional and mental health is managing the stress and managing the stressors. And then finally, environmental. Environmental deep health is knowing that your everyday surroundings support your health and your well-being. It can be really easy to only focus on one area, but all of these intertwine and intersect with one another. And that is why we look at more than just one piece of our health. It's not just about the physical, it's not just about the nutritional, it's not just about the relational, it's how all of these integrate and intersect, which both brings resiliency and brings an ability to engage in each of these areas in a more productive, efficient way. Now, some of you might be familiar with other graphics of how this looks different. For example, this one's pretty familiar, where there's some bigger definitions. Or this one, it is the wholeness wheel from the ELCA. So while they are just a little bit different, again, it still focuses on the same main themes. Okay. One of the things I want, you can engage the chat box if you want, and we'll start I want to take a few minutes of conversation around this question. How do you think the health of ministry leaders correlates to the health of a congregation and community? Maybe the first question is, do you think it does? And if so, how? I'd be curious to hear what you think. So again, feel free to use the chat box. Feel free to unmute yourself. And we'll take just a few minutes with this question. How do you think the health of ministry leaders correlates to the health of a congregation and a community? Would anyone like to offer? We have a healthy pastor equals healthy congregations. Yes, I actually have a little anecdotals. Oh, go ahead. Is someone going to say something? Okay. Yes. Energy and passion and vitality, spiritually and physically able to do ministry. Exactly. And yes, they do correlate, and it is in a complex way. It also can be in simple ways too. For example, just a little anecdote. when I was in Iowa, the church I served, for Vacation Bible School, they were serving hot dogs and chips. And I said, this really isn't food that is conducive towards healthy living. And so we worked it in piece by piece. But, we started with switching to sandwiches and apple slices. And instead of Kool-Aid, we were doing non-sugary drinks, and we were doing milk. A few years later, we were serving spinach meatballs and platters of fruit and platters of vegetables. And it was gone every single night, the food that was there. Part of it was I actually had my own transformation at that point within nutrition and health and wellness. I had put on a lot of weight in seminary, a lot. And I was trying to get back into a comfortable space of how I felt physically. And so when I would do potlucks, I would bring my own, I would bring my own meals with whatever I was eating. Or when I was with the quilting group and they would have their snack time, I would bring my yogurt and my granola. And what it actually did was it was a modeling. And so that model actually inspired a number of other people in the congregation to change their eating behaviors. So even though that seems like something little, it's actually really big. And the same thing is with, like Andrea said, energy and passion. If the health of your leader is a positive outcome, or being able to manage some of the descending voices that are coming at you, being able to have crucial conversations, being able to have the energy to do the various parts of ministry, that really does impact the congregation. So yes, so thank you for that. And so I think one of the things is, you said, Mark, in a very complex way, absolutely. All of these impact one another. And so, the health of a pastor or a ministry leader really does impact the health of a leadership. Because if the ministry leader is able to have a crucial conversation or is able to engage difficult feedback well and in a healthy manner, chances are the council is going to be able to engage that same difficult feedback in a healthy manner. And so it starts branching out. And if the council can engage these difficult topics of social justice or dissenting voices or difficult decisions and be objective and be able to name your why and explain why you're doing something, that is also going to impact the people in your congregation. If a ministry leader is able to speak kindly to their leadership teams, and the leadership teams are able to speak kindly to the congregation, it all just keeps going and going and going. And so, yes, it definitely has the ability to impact the leadership and the physicality of different people. The other thing I really want to point out too is that is what ministry leaders are reporting. And so there are a few different research groups that have actually been looking at this. And one is the Wisconsin Council of Churches just put out their report, as well as the Barna Group just put out their report. And both showed that 1/3 of pastors in the pandemic have thought about leaving ministry. And I think that really draws us to asking the big question of why? If we're having this data, what is the next step where we can take the data and actually think about why is that happening and what is that doing to our congregations, our people, and now and into the future? So a lot of what ministry leaders are reporting is deep exhaustion, burnout, frustration, difficult leadership, and controversy. Now, I will say, we were just a few months into the pandemic, and I remember getting on my soapbox once because there was an article that came out about how pastors have never learned how to do this, and we're
Hey, Tom, hang on a second.
Yeah. Oh, and people are being asked to do things that maybe aren't, that we weren't trained for. And that people were being were there was that common language of, but we weren't trained for this. We weren't trained for this. And I remember saying, well, no one was trained for this. Teachers weren't trained to teach in this way. Doctors weren't trained. Nurses weren't trained to do it in this way. Parents weren't trained to parent in this way. On the flip side, there are things that we were taught. Seminary taught us to be adaptable. It taught us to look at the big picture. It taught us to step back. But we're only able to do that if we can manage all of the other stressors that go with it. And the reason I'm saying this is because, not as a complaint or anything, but I really want to point out some of the things that are sort of unique to ministry, to the area of ministry, that I think is really, really important for congregations and individuals to pay attention to within how it's affecting your ministry leaders, and how that can actually impact if we're going to have leaders into the future, and if we're going to have young leaders into the future that are going to serve the church for 30 or 40 years. And so one of the things that, is common that's going around is the struggles between who's in and who's out. The divisions. We're in a very, very divisive time. And that can be politically, that can be between masks or no masks. It can be differing opinions on all sorts of pieces, on vaccines. I mean, you name it, we've heard it. And in different areas of the United States, people are getting hit differently. It's very different being a pastor in Seattle than it is being in Wisconsin right now, because the leadership is different at the state level, and at the, and what we can do and what parameters are at. And so I think that's worth paying attention to. But I think it's also worth paying attention to, and I say this with all the best intentions, we are in the most self-centered time probably that any of us have ever experienced in history, in our living history. And part of that is due to we've been isolated. We've been stuck in our homes and on Zoom. We've, started to make more decisions specifically for ourselves, or how that impacts us. It's when you're not physically interacting with other people, it's a little bit easier to fall into your silos and into your echo rooms. Social media or media of any kind has really impacted that divisiveness and the self-focus. And there are some things that are actually good about that, of identifying your own values, but it also becomes difficult because we forget about the other. And we forget about what it means to serve and what it means to live the gospel in the midst of high tension and high crisis and trauma. And the truth of the matter is everybody has experienced trauma. Everybody has experienced a loss. And so that is where we're falling at. The hard part with it is a lot of ministry leaders, I think, just anecdotally, are feeling that everybody else can fall apart around them, but they have to be the strong ones. And that can be really difficult. There's also a lot of space where there is language of hate, whether that's between groups or directed at the ministry leaders. When there's a lot of emotions or frustration, it's not uncommon to take it out on somebody that you think is a safe person to take it out on because they have to like you, or you think they'll like you, that type of thing. And so a lot of that inadvertently and unconsciously is being directed at ministry leaders and leadership groups within the church. So that is where it comes back to really experiencing this feeling of exhaustion and burnout and frustration and difficult leadership and controversy. That said, we can actually support our leaders and provide structures and support to mitigate that as much as possible, to help find the spheres of control, to help put safe and healthy boundaries on. And so what does that look like? Well, first of all, we look at the different circles. What are the circles for healthy leaders? It is having a healthy circle of congregations and ministry sites, a friend and family interactions, healthy social media and healthy social media boundaries, and leadership teams. Now, there was this really, and so that is a lot due into the actual leadership part. But let's say we take all of these stressors and all of these things that are happening and layer it on top of health issues and difficult health markers and not having maybe some of the structure for stress relief that involves movement or meditation or prayer or finances, all those other pieces. And so there was actually this really interesting research that was done in 2016 by the journal that was published in the Journal of Pastoral Care for Christian and Jewish clergy leaders. And I think that's really interesting, is that it was across across belief systems and denominations. And here, this was fascinating. Here's what it said. Most clergy perceived their health as very good or excellent, 63% in fact. And yet, when they looked at the health markers, 72% were overweight or obese or had struggling health markers. So there's a big disconnect between perceived health and actual health. And I want to take a moment to actually look at this quote, where it says there is increasing evidence that ministry leaders would benefit from interventions aimed at the prevention of obesity and chronic diseases. These interventions would necessarily include efforts to improve health behaviors, such as physical and nutrition, but also because remember, as I said before, it's not all about food. Interventions would also need to address the issues of perceived occupational distress, focusing not only on educating leaders about ways to cope with stress, but also working with religious organizations, the whole church, the whole ministry leadership, volunteers alike, to develop strategies that might help decrease stress, because stress is the number one piece that adds to hormone imbalance, weight gain, movement, health markers, all of those other pieces. And finally, educating ministry leaders about the importance of self-care is vital, but it may be a difficult task to undertake once they are inundated with the responsibilities of full-time ministry. Think about how often you hear the word, you should take some time off, or self-care is important. You go, well, what does that mean? Or great, but I still have these expectations, or these are still things I have to do, or, and so it really has to be a balance, because just saying to someone, you should take care of yourself, the next question is how, or let us help you, or asking what kind of support is needed. And again, it's not just one-sided. And I think that's what I'm trying to get across here, is that it's not just the responsibility of the ministry leader. Yes, I think a large part of it falls to that. I think it's also a responsibility of the community to be supportive of the health of that leader. And I think it's crucial because, again, so much of our lives are intertwined. There is this graphic piece, and I wanted to show it to you because I think this is really helpful, especially right now. Because when we go into crisis mode, which we're in, we tend to fall into needing to do everything and needing to take care of everybody and needing to help in every way. And whether that is the ministry leaders perceived or the expectation of people in the congregation, it's important to note. And so there is a difference between helping, fixing, and serving. And you'll notice in the first two columns that helping and fixing focus on seeing other people as broken or weak. In both of those categories, burnout is really high and very draining. Both of them lead with expertise, and I'm the only one who can do this, or it has to be me in order for it to be whole. It can limit people from learning how to do things on their own. And I will say, this also is associated with a lot of guilt for ministry leaders because it's like, well, they're paying me, I should do this, or I went to school for this. It's can be hard. There's the deepening of power differentiation. It can cause low self-esteem and being less than the person they're trying to fix. Or we can really look, and again, I say this as a whole congregation, as a ministry leader, as leadership teams, and as participants or volunteers. How do we serve? How do we authentically lead with imperfection and personality and out of our history? How do we authentically integrate the experience of the person being served, and how are relationships created between equals? Serving feels renewing and satisfying, and knows that we are all connected. And I think this is also really important because we talk about compassion and compassion fatigue. And one of the things that's really important to note is compassion should be nurturing. Self-compassion or compassion for others should be nurturing. If it's not being nurtured, it's usually comes back to not being able to differentiate, and we end up in emotional distress. And so compassion and emotional distress are often mistaken for one another. Emotional distress is when you're trying to help or fix and you're trying to take on everybody else's feelings and emotions, and it feels very heavy. And you're like, oh, but I'm taking care of them. I'm helping them. I'm fixing them. If it's not nurturing, that usually means that you're stepping into emotional distress. And this is really important to step back and look at, again, what are your areas of control? What are areas not in your control? What are your boundaries? If you're serving people and caring for them and it feels nurturing and life-giving, yeah, maybe tiring and stuff, those are really key pieces to helping understand that difference. And that is something to be self-aware of where do maybe some boundaries need to be set or some new patterns established. Okay. I think another piece in here that can be really challenging too is there's a difference between important versus urgent. Important stuff is working towards your personal goals. Urgent usually works towards someone else's goals. But we respond to the urgent because the fallout is quicker. And so if someone else is like, oh my gosh, this is so important, is it to you or is it to them? And again, being able to differentiate that. I did actually have a conversation with someone where he's like, but you didn't get back to me. And I said, well, I got back to you in 24 hours. And he's like, but because he was like texting me and stuff. And I'm like, you're not allowed to. And I said, you're not allowed to text me after 8 p.m. I said, unless you're dying, you're not allowed to text me after 8 p.m. Well, I didn't hear back. No, because you know what? And he's like, it was urgent. I said, it was not urgent. I said, you may have thought it was important, but in the context of my day and the other things that I had to deal with, or that I was dealing with, or that I got to deal with, that was not the most important thing. So I totally hear you. I understand that was urgent. I will do my best to get back to you always within 24 hours, but know that there are other pieces going on, so that's just an example, anecdotal piece. Okay, let's keep going. When we talk about boundaries, so important. Who's done boundaries training before with the Synod? Yeah, we all have. Who's walked away and been like, oh, I need better boundaries. And then again, it comes back to that how. We all know what. The how is the really, really hard part about it. And so where have our boundaries gone? There's some of this that gets conditioned into us, whether that's from pastors before us or experiences other people have had. Some of it is that idea of, but I'm their pastor and people need me and it makes me feel important. Again, that's something to pay attention to. Do they really need you? Do you really have to be the one to do it? The other thing, and this happens a lot, is that, especially in ministry, is because ministry leaders are up front and in a public eye, so to speak, there can actually be a lot of judgment, whether purposeful or not. And so also people tend to feel, and I say this in all the best ways, but they feel closer to you than they actually are. For example, I will say one of my gifts is I really enjoy making other people feel important and special. And I know that I have a gift in that, and it's awesome. And it serves me really, really well in ministry. When I left my church in Iowa, I actually had someone say to me, I didn't know you had so many best friends. I was like, I didn't either. But so whereas that's a great skill, it also makes people think that they know me better. I've got pretty solid boundaries. I'm a pretty open book. And at the same time, I'm very careful of what I share and what I don't share. Because, I am the pastor. I'm not a friend. I will absolutely share stories and parts of my life, but there are certain things that are kept for my family or for my close friends that are really, that aren't everybody's business. And that needs to be respected in yourself and by others too. That said, because we're seen up front all the time, because we're seen as leaders, because we're present on social media or showing pictures or sharing stories in the midst of sermons and such, people actually think they know you better. And again, that's across anybody who's a little more public. And with that comes comments that can be really difficult. And that's where people feel they have the right to criticize or offer an opinion in areas that they shouldn't or that are not appropriate. For example, who's heard about their hair or about their clothing or about weight gain or about their children or about their partner? I will say I had an experience a couple weeks ago. I give the person credit where she wanted to meet with me and she said, Pastor, I owe you an apology. And I said, what for? Even though I knew already. We always find out. And she said, I don't believe in saying things to other people if I'm not going to say it to your face. And she said, I badmouthed you and I badmouthed your husband. And, and when she's told me that, I let it sit and I said, that was really brave of you. And I said, I appreciate that you told me. But the key is I didn't say that's okay because it wasn't okay. It was actually really hurtful. And it was not appropriate. And yet when they were in this group, they, kind of took it and ran. And that's where some of those boundaries, start to get crossed. And so I think it's really important to say, to accept the apology but also to not brush it off as saying that's okay. I think part of our boundaries is saying and being verbal about what's okay to say to us and what's not okay to say to us. And we don't need to be snotty about it by any means. I do think that it's easy to fall into this. I'm the only one who can do the work or do it well. And again, this is volunteers or paid staff. They're paying me, therefore I have to produce. And let's be honest, many people are in ministry are people pleasers and we like to be liked. Most people like to be liked anyway, across the board. I just want to fly through these next couple of slides. So when I'm working with ministry leaders, this is one thing I talk a lot about, and you've heard me drop this phrase a few times, and it's called the spheres of control. And how can you walk it back to saying, okay, there is this situation going on, or there's this experience. What is totally in my control? What is somewhat in my control? And what do I have no control over? Things that are totally in your control are your actions, your consistency, some control, maybe it's your kids' schedules or your everyday routine. But again, things kind of, mix and match and that sort of thing. Some control is also working with leadership teams. And then no control, we have zero control over how other people will respond positively or negatively to work being done in this time, whether it was initially at the beginning of the pandemic, in transitional time, or post-COVID. We have no control over what coworkers or parishioners are going to think. We have no control over someone else's behaviors or interactions. The trouble comes in is when we try to have control over the things that we don't have control over. And again, that's where the stress levels start to rise. So where does it come in right now for ministry leaders? We looked at some of the research that's talking about physicality and health markers. We looked at the feelings that ministry leaders are having of exhaustion and burnout. Why? I love that question, why? Always ask the question, why? And when you're working on something, always know your why. It'll help you clarify. But really a lot of it is ministry has changed, and not just because we're digital, it's because the concept of what we're trying to do is very, very different. And so right now, these are not the only areas that ministry leaders are looking at or dealing with, but it is a big part of it right now. And one of them is our job right now is to look at the big picture. Totally. And again, I say this with all care. There are many different ages within our congregations. There are many backgrounds. There are many preferences. As a ministry leader, your job is to actually step back and say, how does it affect or influence all the ages? So there may be one demographic that doesn't like what it's done or doesn't like some of the cultural comments or content that might be put out or a media clip in a sermon. And yet, while it might not resonate with, say, a 65-year-old, it might actually really resonate with a 40-year-old. And so how are we balancing to make sure that we're hitting all of the age groups? And that's really important, I think, for our ministry teams to remember as well, is that there is a balance of trying to, see the big picture. And that's our job, is to step back and see the big picture. It's also our job to look at the triage and what's needed most. I will say, my executive committee last week actually asked me for data, and they requested that I go back through the month of April and actually write down what I did for a majority of my hours as a guesstimate. And they said, we're not doubting that you're working all your hours, not at all. But we think it'll be good for everybody to see where those hours are placed. And they said, I think we're all going to be surprised at it, because it came to a point where I had to say in my executive committee, I don't have any more capacity. Like I'm not willing to work 60 hours a week. I am not willing to give up my workouts. I am, and there are things that are coming up much more that weren't there before. For example, I have many, many more requests now for people to meet with me on a regular basis because they can't get into therapy, or because therapists aren't available. And so, I'm very upfront to say I'm not a therapist, but they're like, we just need to talk and have a place to put it. So that's been a big part of my calendar. That's not stuff I'm going to tell other people about or who I'm meeting with, but that is a big part of my calendar. Everything takes more effort and steps. There's a big piece of learning, with technology that constantly changes, so it really is stepping back. And so what we're doing is actually taking those hours and looking at what's my capacity, and having the council say, these are our 2 or 3 major things that we want you working on. Like, we know that there's all the other pieces, but like, we want great worship, pastoral care, and whatever else it is. And then my hours and my timeframes are going to need to primarily fit into that. And again, I still have control over that, and I still have a large voice. So I'm not feeling super dictated. But what it is then we can also say, if any of these other things want to happen, then it either needs to be volunteer led, or we need to lower our expectations. And so we even talked about that with technology. We're like, yes, we actually have the ability to do more technology. Is that where we actually have to be placing our time? Maybe it is just setting up a phone camera and streaming it. And is it perfect? No. But is that where we want our time spent? There's a finite amount of time in the week. And so, I can spend extra hours on technology, or I can spend extra hours, with a parishioner. Okay. So we're triaging. The other piece of it that has become really big and really controversial is preaching for change. And anyone who's preaching right now is knowing that there are challenges. There's always challenges in preaching, but one thing that's really important to remember is Jesus was political, and I've had people say, oh, you're getting so political. Jesus was political, and he preached politically, not partisan. He was not partisan. He was political. And there's a big difference, because we are called to preach the gospel, and we are called to be challenged. And so this was really interesting. This comment was from one of my young adults. And he actually he went to one of the protests for Black Lives Matter. And I interviewed him for a children's sermon following that and his experience. And it was so interesting. He said, I've totally used this quote many a time because I thought it was perfect. It just summed up really well. He said, I come to my community for comfort. I come to the gospel to be challenged. He said, I need to hear challenging preaching. I come to my community to be comforted, but I come to the gospel to be challenged. And I will say, one of the things that lots of pastors and lots of ministry leaders have heard is, but I just want to be comfortable. Like, I'm not feeling comfortable at church. We're not really meant to. Like, we're supposed to be pushed so that we can go out and serve in a different way, so we can explore different ways. We're not meant to be in a siloed, everybody agrees with me, everybody's in the same place. Like, that's the amazing and awesome thing about a congregation, is it's like one of the incredibly few places where we have different ages, different backgrounds, different sexualities, different beliefs, different experiences and travel and backgrounds. How can we use that to be made uncomfortable for the sake of the gospel and to do something bigger and grow? Like, it's really actually very, very exciting. And then we also find comfort in the relationships with and for other people. So it's a both and. And then a large part of what ministry leaders are doing it is focusing on adaptations. Everything, and that's important to keep in mind with timing and with stressors, because everything that used to take one step now takes multiple steps. For example, communion used to just set out bread and wine. That was great. Remember those days? It was so easy. Now we have to think about, okay, how far are people spaced? Who's touching the bread and the wine? Is it, basically they're hermetically sealed? Is it, individual cups? How far away are the cups placed? Are there, are there gloves being used? Is it being prepared by someone who's vaccinated or unvaccinated? What kind of communication do you need to do around that? Like, there's like 12 steps to every single one that used to be there before. So that actually impacts the capacity levels. And then we're also asking those really important questions of, what do we want to shift? Which personally I think is a super exciting question. What do we stop doing that maybe we don't want to return to? What have we tried that we want to amplify? What are our core values, and how are we really living into that and letting everything else, like, it's okay that it falls away. It's okay that we don't go back to quote unquote normal or what it was before. So these are like three major areas that ministry leaders are being faced with that were there before, but not quite to the same extent. Okay. Again, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I did just want to share this. And so right now, I think these are key areas for healthy leadership right now. And this is where it's important to have structure and support for ministry leaders who can help them do this, who can help develop these healthy practices. Part of that is self-awareness. Part of it is being able to focus on the process rather than an end result, because there's a lot we don't know still. The ability to have crucial conversations, super healthy. Filtering the voices and deciphering of what is meaningful, meaning there's people who have different opinions about different things, and be able to say, I'm hearing you, let's talk about it. We might not agree, but let's talk about it. And you're being heard, even if it may not end up the way that you want. We can disagree and go in a different direction. Like I said, go back to knowing your why. The development of being confident to have the conversation. Learning new things. It's hard to learn new things, but we should always be learning new things, whether that's technology or other things. Health of capacity limits. And then, like I said before, self-compassion. And again, self-compassion isn't just saying I'm okay. Self-compassion is very nurturing and very developmental. And there's a lot to self-compassion. Again, just saying stuff isn't, it's a definite skill to learn. Then how does this all impact? It all interweaves. Like I said, it goes back to that 6 dimensions of deep health, of stress management, food, sleep. Sleep is huge for all of this. Movement and boundaries. So going back to your definition of deep health, has anything changed? Has there been any insight that you've had? Is there anything that you individually or collectively want to focus on? And the thing is we don't do everything at once. It's one very small step at a time. Maybe it's saying I'm going to work 1 less hour today. Maybe it's, it's setting up different practices and having someone who's accountable. It's maybe learning a piece of how to do this, or maybe a research piece. And a big piece of this is also focusing on the progress of it. There is lots of perfectionism out there. There's no such thing as perfect. And no one's going to be perfect, and we're not going to do it right all the time. And so we really focus on progress. Are we inching our way forward? It doesn't need to be an overnight turn. It's one piece at a time. And it is hard work, and we have to be uncomfortable, but we refuse to quit. And so there are a few pieces of just how can we support one another? How can we support ministry leaders? How can we support our congregations so that we have healthy leaders? And I think there's a few different ways, especially for your ministry leaders. There can be practical help. My bishop told us a story about how when she was a parish pastor and she had small kids, The church decided to pay for a house cleaner for a year for her every other week because she was trying to do the ministry of the church and was overwhelmed with small children. A raise or a bonus, and again, I know that it's difficult with different budgets, but that goes really far. Or extra vacation time. Some of it is boundary support, being kind and encouraging and positive about what can be done versus what can't be done. Encouraging healthy boundaries of your ministry leaders. Appropriate conversations within meetings and one-on-ones. Are there things that are starting to be said that are not helpful or conducive to the health of a person or a ministry? And if not, can we call it out and say, I don't think that's an appropriate conversation that we're having? Is it honoring proper self-care with Sabbath time or healthy food gifts or the reminders of the control spheres? And then is there financial support? Is there a place in continuing ed budgets? Is there a place that could go in the budget to pay for your ministry leaders' gym membership? Or, the work that we do with Living Well, it's pricey. It's because you get a lot for it and you get very much individual work and one-on-one coaching. So is there a way to offset some of that cost? Or some other coaching, for example, through Vibrant Faith, who does ministry coaching. So those are, so it's just some different ways to start thinking outside the box a little bit, of what can congregations and individuals do to help support their ministry leaders. Again, not just for the health of the ministry leader. It can be really easy to it's really easy to say, well, that's their responsibility. They should take care of it. It's actually, it's a team effort. Ministry is a team effort. And no one likes to feel like they're flying solo. So how can we help and truly support one another? And how is that reflected in timeframes, in leadership, in budgets and such? I will say one of the ways that my congregation did that, I love to lift weights. So I bought some weights, but I didn't have a place to put it. So it's all in a Sunday school room downstairs. And I have this really great little gym set up because our gyms are closed. That was actually very significant for them to give me the go ahead for that. This is totally not a sales pitch. It's just, this is what we do in Living Well, just so you know. We focus on one-on-one and group support. We focus on the long-term game, the expectations of each person as individuals. So it's not the same expectation for every other person. We do workshops and communication and learning. We do individual calls, and we focus on progress as is defined by each individual person. If you want more information, this is a great way to get in touch. I'm on social media. You can use my email. I also have my regular Gmail is pastorshannon@gmail.com. There's also, like I said, social media, Instagram, Facebook, and such. So, like I said, that was a lot of information in a short amount of time. We've got just a few minutes left. Are there comments, questions, thoughts, or reflections?
Shannon, there is just a chat about how can lay leaders help just decrease the stress or even their expectations of what pastors are doing. And then the second part is just about sometimes when we add, like, I know I need to be better in my health, I need to lose weight, for instance, that can seem overwhelming and add more stress.
Totally.
Especially if you're trying to get in a few more steps in the day. How do you do that?
Those are both great questions. For the first one, how can lay leaders decrease some of the work expectations placed on the pastors? Talk about it. Bring it to light. Whether that comes to counsel, whether that includes sitting down with the leadership team with the pastor there and saying and asking the question, ask them what they need and give them some time to think about it. I think also then communicating that with communication's huge. And I think communicating with the congregation of, these are the priorities set out. So we have to say, okay, if these are our priorities, this 1, 2, and 3, then these things either need to lessen the expectation from the congregation and say, I might not get back to you within this amount of time frame, or, you know, Sunday school is going to be done, but it's not going to look cutesy or fancy. We're not going to have packages, but we will put in, a Taking Faith home sheet in your weekly email, or, you can pick it up at church type thing. So I think honestly, like really speaking to it and being very verbal of what those expectations are, what the perceived expectation, let the pastor explain what the perceived expectations are. And then work together as a team to say what's most important, what is kind of important, and what is not really important. And then when you look at that list, also say, is this realistic? And again, knowing it shifts and changes, but I think that, and then it comes back to being really encouraging and positive, and having, so if that's the decision that council makes, then all of council should be positive about this with other people. And if other people bring complaints, you say, well, this was a decision by council, this was a group decision, and trying to keep, or, that's a different conversation you need to have with someone else in leadership. So was that helpful? Okay. And the second question, yes, trying for more help could add stress in the short term. That is why it's one very small thing at a time. So for example, in Living Well, we talk about a 5-minute action, and that is actually the first thing we start everybody on. That's the one thing that we have everybody do right out of the gate. And it's called a 5-minute action, and you get to decide what that 5-minute action is. Maybe it is, one of the people in the group right now, her 5-minute action is she stands up from her desk and looks out her window at a tree for 5 minutes every day. She sets an alarm on her phone, and that one thing brings her stress level down. But what it is it starts getting you into a pattern of one small piece at a time. And that's what you want, is you want it to be consistent and you want it to be small. Then or maybe that 5-minute action is drinking an extra glass of water, or maybe it is breathing for 5 minutes, or walking around the church building for 5 minutes after a meeting. So you're not sitting as much. Whatever you choose that 5-minute action to be, you do it consistently for 2 weeks. And then you can start to add another one in and another one in, because if it is feeling too overwhelming, then you need to back it off. Another really good way to think about it is on a scale of 1 to 10, how ready, willing, and able am I able to do it? And can I do it? Am I ready on a 9 or 10? Am I willing on a 9 or 10? Am I able on a 9 or 10? And if not, make it even smaller. And if that still isn't a 9 or 10, make it even smaller until it's something that is doable consistently. Yeah. Yeah. And track it in a way that works for you. Maybe that's Post-it notes. Maybe it's a little tally. Doesn't have to be fancy at all. Because yes, if you try to do too much, it adds stress. The goal is to take away stress.
Shannon, one last question. Could you say something about mutual ministry teams? Is it still a thing, and what role would they play in the life of the congregation and ministry leaders?
That is a great question. I honestly think it depends on this is my opinion. This is totally my opinion. I think it depends on the person, the congregation, and the people on the mutual ministry team. Because every team can be different. So some mutual ministry teams, unfortunately, take it as a way of saying, I get to tell the pastor what to do. Others expect that the pastor is going to pour out all confidential information to them. Some are super supportive and are a place to bounce ideas off of, or to have some information moving through the congregation. It really depends. Personally, I don't have a mutual ministry team, but I do have selected people that I know are steady eddies. My council president is actually one of them, that I know that when I'm working through an issue or problem, I call him, and he's able to be very objective. I have a really solid executive committee too, and that's really helpful. We do have a personnel committee, but that's for like formal stuff. But I will say this was hugely, hugely helpful in my first year when I was here at this church, and it was brilliant. They they call themselves Team Shannon. And basically, it was a functional mutual ministry team. For that first year, we met for dinner once a month at someone's house, and it was a confidential place, and it was for me to ask questions. So it wasn't an evaluation of me. And I think that's what happens sometimes with mutual ministry is it becomes an evaluation. It wasn't an evaluation. It was a place where I could ask questions that maybe weren't appropriate to ask in other spaces. So I could say something like, okay, this is what I'm noticing in this interaction. How are they connected to here? Or how do these two groups of people interact? Or what has been some of the history of this? Or this is my interpretation of how this staff member is responding. Am I correct in this? Like, am I being intuitive? Is this accurate? And they can say yes or no. And that was really, really helpful in the first year. They were people who were hand chosen, by a strong leadership who they knew would be confidential, who they knew would be helpful, and who they knew wouldn't have a second agenda. And that was really helpful. And it was also a well represented group. So it wasn't just like one age demographic. Yeah. So again, I think it comes back to it depends. Yeah. If it's healthy for you, go for it. If it's not, maybe it's time to do something different. Well, we are about 6 minutes over. Thank you for your extra time. Thank you for listening to this. I know I did a lot of talking. I hope this was meaningful to you. Again, you have my contact information, so please don't hesitate to reach out with questions or thoughts or ideas. I love talking about this stuff, and I care so deeply about the health of our ministry leaders and the health of our congregations in the ministry, for decades and into the future. So yeah, so we want healthy leaders. So thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, Shannon. Thanks, everyone.